The courtroom fell into a silence so absolute that even breathing seemed forbidden when Madison Hartwell walked through those heavy oak doors like she owned not just the room, but the very concept of justice itself. If this story hits you right in the soul, smash that like button right now. She moved with the kind of confidence that money couldn't buy because it was simply inherited. A birthright wrapped in designer clothes and $1,000 shoes that clicked against the marble floor like a countdown to something terrible. Madison Hartwell, 24 years old, daughter of Governor Richard Hartwell, had never been told no in her entire life, and the way she surveyed the courtroom made it clear she didn't expect to start hearing it today. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Judge Elias Monroe's courtroom, casting long shadows across the wooden benches packed with spectators who had come to witness what the local news had been calling the trial of the decade. The air itself felt heavy, thick with anticipation and the faint smell of old wood and leather-bound law books. Every seat was filled, every eye focused forward, every ear straining to catch the smallest sound. Judge Monroe sat elevated at his bench, a man in his early 60s whose presence commanded respect without demanding it. His silver hair was combed back with precision, his black robes hung perfectly on his frame, and his eyes, those penetrating grey eyes that had witnessed 3 decades of human nature at its worst and occasionally its best, watched Madison Hartwell enter his courtroom with the calm attention of someone who had seen this particular brand of arrogance before and knew exactly how it would end. The charges were serious enough to make even seasoned court observers wince: vehicular assault causing severe bodily harm, leaving the scene of an accident, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and at the center of it all, a young construction worker named Carlos Mendez, who would never walk again without assistance, whose life had been permanently altered on a rainy Tuesday evening 6 months ago when Madison's BMW had blown through a red light at 60 miles per hour and sent him flying 30 feet through the air. Madison took her seat at the defense table next to her attorney, Marcus Pemberton, a man whose hourly rate could feed a family for a month and whose reputation for getting wealthy clients acquitted was matched only by his reputation for exploiting every loophole the legal system offered. Pemberton adjusted his Rolex, straightened his tie, and leaned over to whisper something to Madison that made her smile, actually smile, as if they were discussing weekend plans rather than a man's shattered spine. "All rise," the bailiff announced, though Judge Monroe was already seated. The formality was for everyone else, a reminder that this was his courtroom, his domain, where wealth and political connections meant precisely nothing. "Be seated," Monroe said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made shouting unnecessary. He opened the file before him with deliberate care, his eyes scanning the documents he had already read a dozen times. He knew every detail of this case, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every attempt Madison's legal team had made to suppress, dismiss, or discredit anything that didn't serve their narrative. "Ms. Hartwell," Monroe began, looking up from the file to fix Madison with a gaze that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. "You stand accused of vehicular assault causing grievous bodily harm, fleeing the scene of a serious accident, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead?" Madison stood with practiced grace, smoothing down her cream-colored Chanel suit as if preparing for a photo opportunity. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders. Her makeup was flawless, and her expression carried the kind of bored indifference usually reserved for people waiting in line at the DMV. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and confident, with just the slightest hint of condescension, as if the very question was beneath her. The words hung in the air like a bad smell as Monroe studied her for a long moment before nodding to the prosecution. "Proceed, Mr. Chen." District Attorney James Chen was a 40-year veteran of the prosecutor's office, a man who had built his career on meticulous preparation and unshakable integrity. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and approached the jury with the weight of genuine purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chen began, his voice steady and clear, "on the evening of March 15th, at approximately 7:43 p.m., Madison Hartwell got behind the wheel of her BMW M8 competition after consuming, according to 3 separate witnesses at the Platinum Lounge, at least 4 vodka martinis and 2 shots of tequila. Surveillance footage from the lounge, which we will present, shows Ms. Hartwell stumbling as she left the establishment, laughing with friends about how she drives better drunk anyway. Madison's expression didn't change, but her fingers drummed once against the defense table, a tiny crack in the facade. At 7:51 p.m., Chen continued, Ms. Hartwell's vehicle, traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, ran a red light at the intersection of Madison and 5th Street. Carlos Mendez, a 29-year-old construction worker and father of 2, was crossing that intersection legally in the crosswalk. The impact was catastrophic. Chen paused, letting the weight of that word settle over the courtroom. Mr. Mendez was thrown 30 feet. He suffered a fractured spine, multiple broken ribs, a collapsed lung, severe internal bleeding, and traumatic brain injury. He was in a coma for 17 days. He has undergone 7 surgeries. He will require a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The courtroom was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. And what did Madison Hartwell do after destroying this man's life? Chen's voice rose slightly, not in volume but in intensity. She drove away. According to traffic cameras and multiple eyewitness accounts, she did not stop. She did not call 911. She did not render aid. She fled the scene and, according to phone records, immediately called not the police, not an ambulance, but her father's chief of staff. Pemberton was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is editorializing." "Overruled," Monroe said without hesitation. "These are established facts, Mr. Pemberton. Sit down." The attorney sat, but Madison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Chen walked back to the prosecution table and picked up a tablet. When police arrived at Ms. Hartwell's residence 4 hours later, 4 hours during which her vehicle was taken to a private garage, cleaned, and had its front bumper replaced, she claimed she had been home all evening. Security footage from her apartment complex, however, shows her arriving at 8:47 p.m., more than an hour after the accident. She changed clothes, she showered, and according to her own building security log, she had visitors, specifically 2 employees from Governor Hartwell's office. Madison leaned over to whisper something to Pemberton, who nodded and made a note on his legal pad. "But perhaps most damning," Chen said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean forward, is what Ms. Hartwell said when police finally obtained a warrant to question her 3 days later. When Detective Sarah Williams asked about the accident, Madison Hartwell looked her directly in the eye and said. Chen paused, reading from his notes. "I don't know what you're talking about, and even if I did, do you really think anything would happen to me? My father decides who gets investigated in this state, and you just ended your career." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom like a physical wave. Several jurors' eyes widened. Someone in the gallery gasped audibly. "Objection." Pemberton was up again, his face reddening. "That statement was obtained under duress and without proper counsel present. The statement was made voluntarily in the presence of 3 witnesses," Chen shot back. "Detective Williams, Officer Rodriguez, and Ms. Hartwell's own attorney, who was present via phone." Monroe raised one hand slightly, and both attorneys fell silent immediately. "The statement stands. Continue, Mr. Chen." Over the next 3 hours, the prosecution built a case so airtight that even the most skeptical observer would have struggled to find cracks. Traffic camera footage showed Madison's distinctive BMW running the red light. Multiple witnesses placed her at the Platinum Lounge drinking heavily. Forensic evidence from the original bumper, which police had seized from the private garage before it could be destroyed, matched paint transfers and Carlos Mendez's DNA. Phone records showed 11 calls between Madison, her father's chief of staff, and the family's attorney in the 2 hours following the accident. But the most damaging evidence came when Chen called Carlos Mendez himself to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and a hospital aide wheeled Carlos in. He was a young man who should have been in his prime, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and careful movements that spoke of constant pain. His wheelchair was state-of-the-art, the kind insurance doesn't cover, the kind his family had gone into debt to afford. His wife, Maria, walked beside him, one hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The aide helped position Carlos before the witness stand, and Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Mendez, I want you to know that you may take all the time you need. If you require a break at any point, simply let me know." "Thank you, Your Honor," Carlos said, his voice quiet but steady. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the wheelchair's armrests. Chen approached gently, respectfully. "Mr. Mendez, can you tell the court about your life before March 15th? Carlos took a breath. "I was a foreman for Martinez Construction. Been with the company 8 years. Worked my way up from laborer. I had a crew of 12 guys depending on me. I coached my son's soccer team on weekends. My daughter had just gotten accepted to the magnet school for science. My wife and I were saving for a house. We were so close, just another year maybe." His voice cracked slightly. "I had a good life, a normal life. I worked hard. I came home to my family. I paid my bills. I tried to be a good person. And now?" Chen asked softly. Carlos looked down at his wheelchair. "Now I can't work. I can barely play with my kids without pain. We lost our apartment because the medical bills ate our savings and more. We're living with my wife's parents in their 2-bedroom house. Maria works 2 jobs. My daughter had to turn down the magnet school because we can't afford the transportation. My son quit soccer because I can't coach anymore, and the league fees were too much." Tears rolled down his cheeks, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not the man I was. I'm not the father I was. Every single day I wake up, and for just a second I forget, and then I try to stand, and I remember that my entire life changed because someone thought getting behind the wheel drunk was fine, thought running a red light was fine, thought leaving a human being bleeding on the street was fine." Madison examined her manicured nails. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but Judge Monroe saw it. His eyes narrowed fractionally, and his jaw tightened. Chen let the moment breathe before asking, "Mr. Mendez, did you see the vehicle that hit you?" "For just a second before impact. White BMW, expensive looking. I remember thinking how fast it was going, how wrong that was, and then nothing until I woke up in the hospital 17 days later." "And has anyone from the Hartwell family or their representatives reached out to you?" Carlos shook his head. "The only contact I've had was from a lawyer who showed up at the hospital and offered me $50,000 to sign something saying it was an accident and I didn't want to press charges. When I refused, he told me I was making a mistake, that I was going up against people who could destroy what was left of my life." He looked directly at Madison for the first time. "But I told him that my life was already destroyed. The only thing I had left was the truth." The courtroom was utterly still. "No further questions," Chen said quietly, returning to his seat. Pemberton stood for cross-examination with visible reluctance. He knew how this looked, knew that attacking a paralyzed father of 2 was terrible optics, but Madison had insisted. "Mr. Mendez, isn't it true that you had been working a 12-hour shift that day? Isn't it possible your fatigue caused you to misjudge the crosswalk signal?" "I know what I saw," Carlos said firmly. "I've crossed that intersection 5 days a week for 8 years. I know when it's safe to cross. But you can't be certain of every detail, can you? Trauma affects memory. I'm certain that I was crossing legally and got hit by a car that ran a red light going 60 miles an hour. I'm certain that driver didn't stop. I'm certain that my children watched me learn to feed myself again. Those details I'm very certain about." Pemberton abandoned that line of questioning quickly. No further questions. As Carlos was wheeled out, his wife squeezed his hand, and he reached up to squeeze back, a small gesture of love that spoke volumes about what they'd endured together. The prosecution rested its case just before lunch, and Judge Monroe called a recess. Madison stood immediately, pulling out her phone as if she'd been waiting hours to check her Instagram. Pemberton tried to get her attention, clearly wanting to discuss strategy, but she waved him off and disappeared into the hallway, her heels clicking with each step. In the courthouse bathroom, 2 court staff members would later testify that they overheard Madison on the phone saying, "This is such a joke. Monroe is ancient. Daddy says he'll be gone by next election cycle anyway. Just play along, let these people have their little moment, and then we move on with our lives. Carlos, whatever his name is, will take a settlement eventually. Everyone has a price." When court resumed, it was the defense's turn. Pemberton called a parade of character witnesses, Madison's former professors, family friends, charitable organization heads who had received Hartwell family donations, each testifying to Madison's good character, her volunteer work, her bright future. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to paint Madison as a good person who had made one mistake. But then Pemberton made what would later be considered a catastrophic error. He called Madison herself to the stand. She stood and walked to the witness stand with complete confidence, placing her hand on the Bible without hesitation, swearing to tell the truth with a clear voice and steady eyes. She was an excellent liar, practiced and polished, and she knew it. Pemberton led her through friendly questions. Yes, she had been at the Platinum Lounge. No, she hadn't had that much to drink. The witnesses must have been mistaken. Yes, she had driven home, but carefully, cautiously. No, she didn't recall running any red lights. No, she absolutely did not hit anyone. "So where were you at 7:51 p.m. on March 15th? Pemberton asked. "I was taking a different route home, the one through Riverside. There was construction on my usual route." "And the traffic cameras that show your vehicle at that intersection?" Madison smiled slightly. "My car was stolen 2 days before the accident. I reported it to police. It must have been the thief driving." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was a new claim, one not mentioned in any previous statement or filing. "You reported your car stolen?" Pemberton asked, as if hearing this for the first time, which he probably was. "Yes, I have the report number somewhere. It must have gotten lost in all the confusion." Chen was already flipping through police records, his expression darkening. There was no stolen vehicle report. Madison had just committed perjury in open court, but she wasn't done. "Your Honor," Madison said, turning to address Monroe directly with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I want to be clear. I feel terrible about what happened to Mr. Mendez, truly, but I wasn't the person driving my car that night. Someone stole my vehicle, caused that accident, and now I'm being blamed because of who my family is. This is political persecution, pure and simple." Judge Monroe's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Ms. Hartwell, there is no stolen vehicle report in any police database for your car during that time period." "Then it must have been filed incorrectly," Madison said with a shrug. "Mistakes happen." "Mistakes," Monroe repeated slowly, each syllable weighted. It was Chen's turn for cross-examination, and he approached like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "Ms. Hartwell, you testified that your car was stolen, yet you made insurance payments on it for 3 months after the alleged theft. Why would you insure a stolen vehicle?" Madison blinked. I forgot to cancel it." "You forgot to cancel insurance on a $60,000 stolen vehicle?" "I have a lot on my mind." "Indeed. Let's talk about what was on your mind the night of March 15th. We have testimony from 3 separate witnesses at the Platinum Lounge that you consumed at least 6 drinks. We have video of you stumbling to your car. We have your own voice, recorded on your friend Jessica's phone, saying, 'Watch me drift these turns like Tokyo.' Does that sound like someone whose car was stolen?" "That video could be from any night," Madison shot back, her polished demeanor slipping slightly. Chen smiled. "It wasn't pleasant. The video is time-stamped, March 15th, 7:38 p.m., 5 minutes before you ran a red light and destroyed a man's life." That's not. We have phone records showing you called your father's chief of staff 9 times in the 2 hours after the accident. Why would you need to call him 9 times if you didn't know anything about an accident? I call him frequently. We're close. At 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night, calling him screaming about fixing this. Those are his words from his testimony in the preliminary hearing. What needed fixing, Ms. Hartwell? Madison's jaw clenched. I don't recall that conversation. You don't recall a conversation that happened 6 months ago, but you clearly remember that your car was stolen, despite no record of you reporting it. I reported it to someone. I don't remember who. There is no report, Ms. Hartwell. You're lying under oath. Objection! Pemberton was on his feet. Sustained, Monroe said. Rephrase, Mr. Chen. Ms. Hartwell, isn't it true that you never reported your car stolen because it was never stolen? Isn't it true that you got drunk, drove recklessly, hit Carlos Mendez, and then fled the scene while he lay bleeding on the pavement? No! Madison's voice rose for the first time, her composure cracking. That's not what happened. Then what did happen? I told you. The truth, Ms. Hartwell. What actually happened? I don't have to answer to you. Madison snapped, her face flushing. Do you know who my father is? Do you know what kind of power my family has? My father decides who keeps their job in this state, who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted. This is a witch hunt because people are jealous of my family, because they can't stand that we have more than them. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, jurors' eyes went wide, and even Pemberton dropped his head into his hands. Ms. Hartwell, Judge Monroe said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. The room fell instantly silent. What did you just say? Madison seemed to realize her mistake, but pride and entitlement won out over common sense. She lifted her chin defiantly. I said my family decides how things work in this state. My father is the governor. He appoints judges. He influences prosecutors. He controls funding for courts. You think any of this matters? You think your little gavel and your black robe mean anything? My family decides who gets punished and who doesn't, and I guarantee you, Judge Monroe, I won't be getting punished. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Judge Monroe slowly removed his glasses and set them on the bench. He steepled his fingers and looked at Madison Hartwell with an expression that made several people in the courtroom visibly uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Ms. Hartwell, in my 30 years on this bench, I have witnessed humanity at its lowest points. I have seen people driven to terrible acts by poverty, by desperation, by mental illness, by circumstances beyond their control. I've seen people commit crimes and show genuine remorse, genuine attempts at redemption. I have seen the worst society has to offer walk through those doors. He paused, his gray eyes locked on Madison. But I have never seen such a pure distillation of arrogant entitlement. You sat in my courtroom and watched a man in a wheelchair describe how you destroyed his life. You heard him speak about his children, his wife, his shattered dreams. And you examined your fingernails. You checked your phone. You smiled. Madison's face had gone pale. And now, Monroe continued, his voice growing harder, you have the audacity to threaten this court, to suggest that your family's political power places you above the law, to declare that you decide who gets punished. Let me be absolutely clear, Miss Hartwell. In this courtroom, I decide. Not your father, not his staff, not his money or his connections. Me and the law. He leaned forward slightly. The law doesn't care who your father is. The law doesn't care about your designer clothes or your expensive attorney. The law doesn't care that you think you're special. The law cares about one thing, justice. And justice, Ms. Hartwell, is coming for you. Madison tried to speak, but no words came out. This trial will continue, Monroe said, and when the jury returns their verdict, which, based on the evidence presented, seems rather clear, you will be sentenced. And I promise you this, your sentence will reflect not only the severity of your crimes, but the contempt you have shown for this court, for your victim, and for the very concept of equal justice under law. He put his glasses back on. Bailiff, Ms. Hartwell's bail is revoked effective immediately. She will be remanded to custody pending the jury's verdict. Your Honor, you can't, Pemberton began. I absolutely can, Mr. Pemberton. Your client just threatened this court and confessed to believing she's above the law. She's a flight risk and a danger to the integrity of this process. Bailiff, take her into custody. As two uniformed officers approached Madison, her carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. You can't do this. My father will have your job. You're finished. You're... Ms. Hartwell, Monroe said, his voice glacial. Every word you speak is making your situation worse. I suggest you stop talking. The officers took Madison by her arms. She tried to pull away, her Chanel suit wrinkling, her perfect hair falling into her face, and led her toward the door that led to the holding cells. Her high heels dragged against the floor as she looked back at Pemberton with panic in her eyes. Fix this, she screamed at him. Call my father. Call... The door closed behind her, cutting off her voice, and the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. We'll resume tomorrow morning at 9, Monroe said. Jury, I remind you not to discuss this case with anyone. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell with finality. The next morning, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they filed back in, not one of them looked at Madison, who sat at the defense table in a jail jumpsuit, her makeup gone, her hair pulled back, looking for the first time like someone who understood consequences might be real. Has the jury reached a verdict? The clerk asked. We have, Your Honor. The jury foreman, a retired school teacher, stood with the verdict sheet. On the count of vehicular assault, causing grievous bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of leaving the scene of an accident, guilty. On the count of tampering with evidence, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the count of perjury, guilty. Madison's mother, seated in the front row of the gallery, began to cry. Her father, Governor Hartwell, sat stone-faced, his political calculus clearly running through his mind. Judge Monroe thanked the jury and set sentencing for 1 week later. During that week, Pemberton filed motion after motion for a new trial, for judgment notwithstanding the verdict, for leniency based on Madison's age and lack of prior record. Every motion was denied. On sentencing day, the courtroom was even more packed than during the trial. National news outlets had picked up the story. Governor's daughter convicted in hit and run. Judge Monroe entered and took his seat, and the room fell silent immediately. He opened a file, read through several pages, then looked at Madison. Ms. Hartwell, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers on multiple felony counts. Before I impose sentence, do you wish to address the court? Pemberton had clearly coached her. Madison stood, her hands clasped in front of her, and said in a small voice, I'm sorry for what happened to Mr. Mendez. I'm sorry for my behavior in this courtroom. I take full responsibility for my actions. The words were right, but they were hollow, delivered without conviction or genuine remorse. Monroe saw through them instantly. Ms. Hartwell, the law provides certain guidelines for sentencing in cases like yours. The standard sentence for vehicular assault causing grievous bodily harm is 3 to 7 years. Leaving the scene adds another 2 to 5. Your other convictions carry additional time. A lenient sentence with credit for time served and good behavior might total 8 to 10 years. Pemberton nodded slightly, clearly hoping for the low end. However, Monroe continued, the law also provides for enhanced sentencing when circumstances warrant. Your actions after the crime, the attempted cover-up, the evidence tampering, the intimidation of witnesses, the abuse of political connections, and your stunning display of contempt in this courtroom, those are circumstances that warrant enhancement. Madison's face went white. You destroyed a good man's life and felt nothing, Monroe said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. You used your family's power to try to escape responsibility. You threatened this court. You showed no remorse until you were convicted. Even now, your apology rings false. He paused, letting the moment build. Carlos Mendez will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair because you were too arrogant to call a car service. His children will grow up watching their father struggle. His wife works 2 jobs to keep their family afloat. And you thought you were above consequences. Monroe's eyes were hard as steel. I am sentencing you to the maximum term allowed under law for each count, to be served consecutively. That's 7 years for vehicular assault, 5 years for leaving the scene, 4 years for evidence tampering, 5 years for obstruction of justice, and 3 years for perjury, 24 years in state prison. The courtroom exploded. Madison screamed. Her mother collapsed, sobbing. Her father stood, his face purple with rage, pointing at Monroe. This is a political hit job. I'll see you disbarred. Governor Hartwell, Monroe said, his voice cutting through the chaos. If you continue, I will hold you in contempt. Your daughter committed serious crimes and has been sentenced accordingly. If you wish to appeal, that is your right, but do not threaten this court. Security officers were already moving to restore order. Madison was being restrained as she screamed at Monroe, her composure completely obliterated, the mask of entitlement replaced by raw panic. Additionally, Monroe said, raising his voice to be heard, Ms. Hartwell will pay full restitution to Carlos Mendez in the amount of $2 million for medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering. Her driver's license is permanently revoked, and upon release, she will serve 5 years of supervised probation. He looked at Madison one final time. You told this court that your family decides who gets punished. You were wrong. In this courtroom, justice decides, and justice has spoken. Bailiff, remove the prisoner. As Madison was led away, still screaming, still fighting, Judge Monroe sat back and watched her go. He felt no satisfaction. No triumph, just the quiet certainty that he had done his job, that the law had been applied equally, that one more person who thought they were above consequences had learned otherwise. Carlos Mendez, watching from the gallery, reached for his wife's hand and squeezed it. It wasn't victory, nothing could give him back what he'd lost, but it was something. It was justice. It was the system, flawed and imperfect as it was, actually working for once. As the courtroom emptied, Monroe remained at his bench, making notes in his file. He had been a judge for 30 years, and he would be a judge for as many more as his health allowed. He had weathered political pressure before, angry governors, wealthy defendants, influential families who thought their money mattered in his courtroom. They were all wrong. The law was the only thing that mattered. And in Judge Elias Monroe's courtroom, the law would always prevail. Because at the end of every trial, after all the evidence and arguments and posturing, there was only one question that mattered. Did justice prevail? And today, watching Madison Hartwell disappear through that door in handcuffs, understanding for the first time in her life that actions have consequences, Monroe knew the answer. Justice had prevailed, not because of who the victim was or who the defendant was, but because the law treated them both as equals. Carlos Mendez, a construction worker with nothing but his integrity, had the same standing in that courtroom as Madison Hartwell, the governor's daughter with all her family's power and wealth. That was justice. That was what Monroe had sworn to uphold, and that was what he would continue to defend for as long as he wore the black robe. This is what true justice looks like: equal, blind, uncompromising. If this story reminded you that no one is above the law, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories, and comment "Justice for All" below, along with where you're watching from. Because in Judge Monroe's courtroom, the only thing that matters is the truth, and the only voice that echoes is the voice of justice itself.